If you would turn with me to the book of Acts chapter 27. We have a passage today that we've been talking and studying over this past week. There's a huge encouragement for our church this morning, for the body this morning, for you and I. I hope you came this morning, okay? I hope you came this morning ready to get into God's Word. All right? I hope you guys had your coffee this morning. Everybody have their coffee? Coffee drinkers? No? Okay, you're probably going to wait till after service, right? All right. That tells me that maybe we were either running late, right? Or you didn't set the timer. I have a really cool coffee maker at home that has a timer. I can program it. And in the morning, I'll hear it grinding the beans and, start up. And I'm like, yes. And then the smell, love it, right? I really do. I love it. But I have to get it ready the night before. Otherwise, it's useless, right? So I think it's the same way in our lives. Are you following me? I believe it's the same way in our lives. There's a lot of prep that has to go on in our lives to prepare us, okay? To prepare us. It's not as easy as programming something, pressing a button and saying, okay, it's going to be ready tomorrow. Are you listening to me? Okay, so in our own lives, there are steps we have to take. There are things we need to do. There is a lifestyle that we need to fall into in order for us to be able to weather the storms ahead. In order for you and I to be able to sink deep, to hold on and be strong and not fall apart when times get tough, okay? To not lose hope when it starts to look hopeless and things start to get dark in our lives, there are steps we need to take before that. There's preparation that needs to be done. There's some experience that needs to be gained alongside of Jesus Christ. How many of you are following with me this morning? I'm going to give just a little bit of background on what's going on in chapter 27 and just give you some fun little facts or things that I thought were cool, that we thought were cool to share. I'm going to be skipping over verses just for the sake of time. I would love to read this passage with you guys, though. This is something that it's kind of like a movie for me as I was reading it, okay? As I was reading it, this is a beautiful passage, and it's very descriptive. What St. Luke is pretty much the account that he's giving about the storm and the shipwreck and the travel from that they were taking to Italy with Paul as a prisoner. And I want you to get into it at home. Okay, today we're going to skip over some of these verses, but when you get home and on your own time, read over this passage. It's fun, especially for us that are like coastal here, okay? Most of us live near a body of water, whether it may be, the Redondo Beach side, okay? Hermosa, Manhattan, PV, or out here on the docks. So I think this is something that all of us can relate to. And so it goes that in the first verses, we see that Paul, check this out, Paul is being escorted, okay, by an imperial guard. This is really cool. It means that Paul, okay, is a prisoner, an imperial prisoner, okay, that is being guarded by a specific group, a specific team. They're kind of like an elite task force. Okay, if you go there with verse 1 with me, it says, when it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion. Now, how many of you know a centurion is in charge of about how many soldiers? Awesome. Okay, we got some scholars this morning. Good thing I studied. Now, it says that he's a centurion, but watch what it says next. Named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. Okay? In other translations, it says that he was of the Augustus cohort. Following me? So that means that they were kind of like Navy SEALs. Okay? They were an elite task force of their time. These guys, Julius and some of his men, were made responsible and given charge over Paul. Now, this is what's really cool and really interesting is that they already had somewhat of a relationship, and it's obvious that he was respected by them. Because in the following passages, we see that when they arrive in one of the cities, Paul is given favor. And check this out. He's a prisoner, right? Everybody's tracking with me? But it says that he was allowed to visit his friends. And it doesn't tell us that they escorted him. Are you tracking with me? Watch what he says. The next day we landed at Sidon. And Julius, watch this, and Julius, in kindness to Paul, this is verse 3, allowed him to go to his friends so they might provide for his needs. Isn't that beautiful? That says a lot about Paul. It says a lot about the relationships he built, even though he was a prisoner. Are you tracking with me? So then you and I, as God's children, as Christ's disciples, okay, we have such a responsibility to the world, to the authority of our land. I don't know if I'm not even going to preach on this, but this is a really nice point to look at and to acknowledge that Paul, okay, made great relationships and connections to those who were above him and those who were authority and given charge over him. That they would give him freedom, arriving at one of the cities. That's a lot of trust, don't you think? This is a prisoner, right? And he's a prisoner of Rome, of all things. He's going to go to answer and speak and see and be presented to Caesar. That's why he's going to Rome. He's going to the highest court system they had, to the Supreme Court, to meet with the man himself. I thought that was really interesting. And so then it says, from there we put out to sea again and passed to the lee of Cyprus. Now there's a couple of maps that I picked up that I thought would be cool to look at as we're reading. Okay, so if you're listening, we can look at the maps and have the maps up at least for a few seconds. But we're going to see how this journey that Paul was on, okay, as they leave Caesarea, they go, you see the route that they take. And so everything we're reading about is pretty much on this map. Some of the islands are a little small, okay, they're hard to see or hard to read, but you can see there the route that they were going on, which wasn't the route they intended to take. And it says, from there we put out to sea again and passed the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. When we had sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship. Okay, we have some images of some ships what they might have looked like at that time. These vessels were merchant vessels. And now I want us to think about this really quick. These are just like some renderings that we found of what they might have looked like. They might have been bigger than this, okay, to carry the tons of cargo that they had. And here's one with a little image that shows the inside, what the inside might have looked like. Those aren't really supposed to be people. They're like vessels that carried a lot of the cargo or what the product that they were shipping, okay, that they were carrying. And those were on the side, on the right side, those are like what I guess they're like containers, the containers that they had inside, what they might have looked like. So these are just renderings of what these ships might have looked like. These Alexandrian ships. Alexandria being a city from Egypt, okay, a coastal city in Egypt. Verse 7, we made slow headway for many days and had difficulty arriving off Cnidus. When the wind did not allow us to hold our course, we sailed to the lee of Crete, opposite of Salmon. We moved along the coast with difficulty and came to a place called Fair Havens, near the town of Lasea. Much time had been lost, and sailing had already become dangerous because by now it was after the Day of Atonement. So Paul warned them, men, I can see that our voyage is going to be disastrous and bring great loss to the ship and cargo and even to our very own lives. But the centurion, instead of listening to what Paul said, followed the advice of the pilot and of the owner of the ship. And since the harbor was unsuitable to winter, and the majority decided that we should sail on, hoping to reach Phoenix and winter there. This was a harbor in Crete facing both southwest and northwest. It's very interesting what's going on here because they're deciding to go against the warning that Paul has given them. Paul is pretty well experienced on these waters. Most of his journeys, missionary journeys, were up and down these waters. And so he knew what these storms might have looked like. He knew the dangers that were facing them on these storms. But see, a lot of times, because we have other intentions or we have other goals or we have our own desires that we would like to fulfill, we ignore warning signs in our lives. Yes? Yes? I've ignored so many warning signs in my life where God clearly was saying to me, Joe, don't go and do that. Joe, you have no business being there right now. Joe, you have no business in what you're doing right now. But I would ignore these warnings, and I would see the warnings of God's hand in my life and continue to ignore them, only to find myself stuck in the middle of a life storm, a major life storm or life crisis. I don't know how many of us have ever been there before or done that. But see, the captain, the owner of the ship, probably had other interests, right? He had a ship full of wheat. And it was very likely, now, if you saw what it was saying and describing, they're like in the end of fall going into winter time. So it was very likely this was the last of the harvest, okay, that was coming out of their region heading towards Italy. And so he looked at probably profiting quite a bit. You follow me? It was probably it was fully loaded. And not just with wheat, but other types of merchandise was on there. Another product was on there that they were taking to Italy. Winter was about to begin. This is one of those storms that is coming in at the beginning of winter. And they didn't want to stay on the other city because it was probably a smaller city and wasn't going to be a place where there was much entertainment for them. That's why they wanted to go in winter in Phoenix. It's very likely they had their own interests. Like, why do we want to stay here for? This place is too small. There's nothing to do here. Let's get to Phoenix. It's a bigger port. There's much more to do. There's lots more things to have fun. There's a lot more things for us to enjoy. We're sailors. What do sailors do? Sail. Yeah, let's leave it at that, right? They sail. These guys had other interests in mind. And I think a lot of times in our lives, we have other desires that come and become, the leading and the reason why we tend to ignore God's warnings in our lives. Well, Lord, that's where I want to be. That's where all my friends are. It feels good to do this. This is what I enjoy doing. And God is saying, I need you to stop. I need you to put aside your interests and your desires and put me first at the center of your life. And heed the warning signs that I'm giving you. They ignored him. They ignored Paul, as many of us do in our own life. A lot of times, these warnings are really small, like gentle winds. It says that when they first put out to sea, there was a gentle wind. And so they thought, hey, let's get on. We can make it. Because they felt it was a good wind that would get them going, but without realizing what was ahead. And a lot of times in life, that's how things start. We think, hey, this is cool. I'm just dipping into it just a little bit. There's nothing wrong here. Hey, we're just having a good time. We're just having fun. I'm just having a great time, Lord. Come on. What's the big deal? We started asking that question, right? Why? Because we're feeling that the Holy Spirit began to speak to our minds and our hearts, and we're saying, what's the big deal? I'm not hurting anybody. How many of us have heard that before? Or have even said it, right? Who am I hurting? I'm not hurting anybody around me. I'm just going over there by myself, Lord. Why can't you just leave me alone and let me do what I want to do? And the Lord is saying, hey, man, I need you to stay away. Because what happened to that gentle wind? It became hurricane force. The wind became a storm. The wind became so bad of a storm that it says they began to lose hope. For almost 14 days, they had no sunlight. Not even the moon or the stars at night were coming through. They were in complete darkness for a majority of the time that they were out at sea. Complete darkness. And that's the danger that each and every one of us faces, that when we begin on that journey and we ignore God's warnings in our life and we take it upon ourselves to do what we want to do, as time goes by and as things get worse, doesn't it get very cloudy in our lives? Doesn't it begin to look like there's almost no light at the end of the tunnel? Sometimes we get into such big problems. Sometimes the problems of life, the sickness of life, the disease of life, sometimes becomes so great and we lose the focus that we have on God that all of a sudden things begin to look very hopeless. All of a sudden things begin to look very bleak. And we begin to say, Lord, what am I doing? Why even go on? Why even continue? And we begin to get desperate. And all of this then can become like a depression in our lives. A downward spiral that now all of a sudden we can't stop. Some of the description here and what was going on with them says that they just set down the sails, they threw the anchors out, Why did they do that? At first, I didn't understand that. Then I realized and I found out they threw the anchors out because they didn't want the wind to take them in whatever direction the wind would take them. They wanted to go with the current. And so they threw the anchors out, dropped the sails, and they just held on. They started panicking. They even went as far, this was what like blew my mind. They went as far as to try to wrap this entire ship with rope. Because they felt, hey, if we hit a sandbar, if we hit something, at least that'll help keep the ship intact. They were trying to do everything possible to save their cargo and save what they had on that, because they said, we cannot lose all this money. We cannot lose all this merchandise. No way. How are we gonna make it through the winter if we lose all this merchandise? They were betting on it. Have you guys ever seen those shows? I think they're like on Discovery, like Biggest Catch, right? Have you ever seen those guys? They get, ooh, man. And if another ship comes in, right, in the area that they're fishing, all of a sudden they get on the radios, right, and they just start talking sailor talk to each other. You guys think it's funny because I know some of us get into that kind of sailor talk sometimes too. Don't come crowd in my space, right? Let's keep reading a little bit more, and then we're going to conclude in a minute. But here's what I want us to see. When the storm came, something happened as Paul began to see that they were losing hope. They were hungry. Have you ever been out at sea on a storm? Anybody here? Yeah? Paco has. He's a Navy man. I'm over here talking about Navy men, and there's Paco right there. He's my witness. Been out at a storm and sea. I had this really small experience. I was about 17 years old, and if you know where my background, I'm from the desert, okay? Most water we see is the Colorado River, and anytime we turn on the sprinklers. 17 years old, some of the guys from our church back home were like, hey, let's go on a deep sea fishing trip out of San Diego. Yeah, let's go. I signed up for it. A bunch of my friends were going. I said, yeah, man, that's going to be fun. We used to fish catfish in the Colorado River or the canals there around Yuma. That's where we're from, okay? Carp, that kind of fish. Simple fishing, man. Sometimes we'd even just use our BB guns. So we get to San Diego, right, and it's overcast and it's a little bit breezy on shore. We don't think nothing of it. What do we know? We had no clue what we were getting into. So we got on this fishing boat, and then we find out that we're going about 2 hours out. I didn't know what that meant or how far that was. All I know is that at first we were so excited. We were about 45 minutes out. I look back and I don't see any land. Really, it's just like a little speck. Whatever, it's cool. There's like probably, I don't know, there was maybe 100 people on the ship, maybe less. 75, it was a pretty big fishing boat. It had like two stories. It was really nice, right? And me and some of my friends from back home, we were and we thought this was awesome. We thought this is cool. All of a sudden, the waves just started getting bigger and the wind started getting stronger. It started raining a little bit, like a little sprinkle at first, and then it started getting a little harder. It'd go off and on. But then the waves out there started getting really big. So we thought we were awesome. We thought we were like Leonardo DiCaprio, right? We were out in the front of this boat, and we were like, yeah, let's see who can do it without holding on, right? And we'd just see that boat go up, and then you'd lose sight of the water. We're like, what the, right? That thing would come crashing down. We were getting splashed. Yeah, we were like, this is awesome. And then they stopped, and they said, all right, it's time to, there's a bunch of fish here. They have that sonar stuff and really cool gadgets now, right? So, yeah, there's a bunch of fish here, a lot of tuna, blah, blah, blah. They're going on. We know nothing about it. So I'm throwing my line out. Man, I'm like, we're not catching anything. Now we're just standing there, right? Now it's about, I think we left about 7 in the morning, 6:30, 7 a.m. Now it's getting close to, 10:30. Now we're just bobbing on all these waves. Right? And I'm standing there with my friends. We're still having fun. But something started creeping in there, and we were just kind of like taking deep breaths. I didn't know what we were supposed to be doing. All of a sudden, I caught something, and I was like, yes, now I have something to take home. My dad's going to be so excited. We're going to be able to fry this fish. We love frying fish back home. Catfish, especially, of course. And man, my line started going. The guys were like, you got something, you got something. We started bringing it in. It was a bird, man. I didn't know those guys could do that. These guys were like diving in the water, right? These seagulls were diving in the water and they were getting our bait. Ah, man, I pulled up this bird. I was so mad. I felt so like, all these guys on the boat were pulling out these fish. One guy had a marlin on his line. That thing was going, it was crazy. I was like, dude, this is going to be awesome. We're going to take bags of fish home, right? And after a little while, we were just like all hunched over the trash can. And they weren't even ready to head back yet. They were like, we ain't going back. There's like, all these people paid to be out here. We're not going back for 3 of you guys that are all puking your brains out. And at first it was just kind of like, oh, he got sick. We were laughing. And then it started hitting each and every one of us. No Dramamine, no nothing. We didn't know, right? We were soaked. We were wet. We were scared. There was nothing in our stomachs. And this is just like a little small experience compared to what Paul and his guys were going through. 14 days battling the ocean, right? 14 days without sunlight, without the light of the stars or the moon. Can you imagine how hungry they were? They had already been fasting because of the Day of Atonement. And then they went on the ship, and then they fasted for 14 more days. Can you imagine how weak they were after fighting? They started throwing things over. They started throwing things out. Get rid of all of it. They were like, we need to get rid of all of it. We need to salvage the ship. We need to do everything possible to save the ship and save ourselves. Get rid of everything. And they did it all like a little bit at a time. They just tossed things out. I believe in our lives, God is calling many of us to toss things out. There's things in our lives that God is saying, these things are holding you back. These things are weighing you down. There's pride in your life. There's arrogance in your life. Unforgiveness. Anger. Man. And he's saying, why? All these things are just holding you back. They're going to hurt you if you don't get rid of them. Toss them out. But something happened. And Paul got down and he started praying. Because if you remember, his warning first said, we might all be lost if we go and face this storm. It's very possible we might all be lost. We might all die, guys. But in the middle of the storm there, Paul gets down and he starts praying. What are we doing when we start facing the storms in our life? Are we jumping ship like some of the sailors wanted to do? They tried to sneak some of the lifeboats out, and Paul said, hey, hold on. Tell those guys to stop. Because God had visited Paul. It says that the angel of the Lord had visited Paul that night and stood with him. And this morning, I believe that if you are going through life's storm, whatever storm you might be facing, there may be a storm coming your way. And God is saying, are you prepared to face that storm? Are you standing with me? Or are you standing alone? Are you trying to stand on your own strength and battle these storms on your own? Or are you going to allow me to stand with you and give you the strength and give you the resources you need to battle this storm? No matter how small or how big, we all need the Lord to stand with us. Are you tracking with me this morning? No matter how small or how big the storm is, we all need the Lord Jesus Christ to be standing with us. And Paul stood up. Almost 300 people were on that ship. He stood up and he says, God, the God that I belong to, I don't know who you belong to today, but you see, he took charge. Because the Lord had visited him and told him, hey, don't worry about it. He reminded them, hey, God has told me that not one hair on your heads is going to be touched. It's going to be hurt. We're all going to make it out of this alive, but we got to stay together and we got to trust God. You see what he did? He stood up in the middle of the storm and he took charge. So what's everybody else around us seeing from our behavior in the middle of our storms? Are we standing up and taking charge? Or are we rolling up into a little ball like little babies and just crying, sucking our thumb? Right? God is calling all of us to stand in the midst of the storm. God is calling you, he's calling me this morning to stand firm in the midst of the storm. To stand strong no matter how bad it gets. And to say, Lord, I want you to be in charge. I want you to captain my ship. Lord, I need you to stand next to me.